I fear I may have made a terrible mistake. I have been accused of a terrible thing.
No matter what it is, girl, you'll find that out here, world is safe for you.
The native girl showed up in tears. The cowboy said, "You don't have to pretend with me." The September afternoon sun beat down on Willow Creek, Wyoming, 1,878, painting the prairie in broad strokes of gold and amber. The vast blue sky, broken only by the occasional high-soaring hawk, seemed to swallow the small, dusty frontier town whole. At the wooden railway station, the distant whistle of an approaching train sliced through the stillness, a lonesome, metallic cry promising new goods and new faces. For Carrick Montgomery, a man of routine forged by the unforgiving land, the train's arrival was a lifeline. He wasn't here for a mail-order bride, as so many of his kind were. He was here for a much-needed shipment of farming tools, promised to him from as far away as Cheyenne. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here. Carrick was a man weathered by sun and toil, his frame lean and strong at 31. The brim of his old Stetson was pulled low, shielding his eyes as he scanned the horizon. He was patient, but he was also acutely aware of his surroundings. Life in the territory had taught him that even the most mundane moments could turn into a test of character, or worse, a fight for survival. As the train's wheels screeched on the tracks, the immense locomotive slowed to a halt with a hiss of steam and a billow of black smoke. The passenger cars were the first to draw his eye, and what he saw there caused a flicker of quiet tension throughout the platform. A group of Lakota people began to disembark. They weren't in war, paint, or regalia, just ordinary folks in simple, travel-stained clothing, but their presence was enough to cause the white settlers on the platform to instinctively retreat a few steps. A nervous murmur rippled through the small crowd. Carrick, though not a man given to prejudice, had heard enough stories to know that caution was a wise companion in this land. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, his hands resting lightly on the belt of his trousers. From the last car emerged a young woman unlike the others. Her hair was braided into 2 neat plaits, and her clothing, a simple buckskin tunic and leggings, was clean and well kept. She carried no weapon, but in her eyes there was a spark of fierce independence that drew his gaze. That was Winona, a name meaning firstborn daughter in the Lakota tongue. She wasn't here to be a wife or to trade. She was here on a solitary quest, a promise she had made to her past. She struggled with a heavy wooden trunk, its worn edges a testament to its long journey. As she reached the platform, her footing faltered. The trunk, too heavy for her slender frame, slipped from her grasp and crashed to the wooden planks with a splintering thud. A scattering of items rolled out, but Winona's attention immediately fixated on 2 objects, a small, intricately carved wooden horse and a delicate beadwork necklace. She knelt quickly, her hands trembling as she gathered her precious belongings, a silent plea on her face. A loud, mocking laugh broke the silence. A man in a tailored suit, a slick, self-important look on his face, stepped forward. He stood over Winona, his hands on his hips. "Well, look at this," he sneered for everyone to hear. "A lost Indian princess, spilling her secrets, probably here to peddle her trinkets to the white man." A few nervous chuckles followed his cruel words, and Winona's head dropped, her face burning with shame. She was used to the stares and the cruel whispers, but they never got any easier to bear. Carrick had witnessed the entire scene. The man's condescending tone grated on him. He had no love for bullies, and he saw the genuine pain in Winona's eyes. Ignoring the unspoken warning from the crowd, he strode forward. Without a word, he knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands moving with a surprising gentleness as he helped her gather her belongings. Winona looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and suspicion. She couldn't fathom why a white man would do this. He wasn't looking at her with pity, but with a quiet, solemn respect. Carrick's hands, so often wrapped around a shovel or a horse's reins, carefully picked up the small wooden horse. The craftsmanship was stunning, and despite a small crack from the fall, its spirit seemed intact. "It's a fine piece," he said, his voice low and steady, only for her to hear. "Does it hold special meaning for you?" Winona's gaze met his. The unexpected kindness in his voice disarmed her, and she felt a lump form in her throat. She simply nodded. "It was my brother's," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of a far greater story than she was willing to share. An awkward silence hung between them, a fragile bubble in the tense air. Carrick saw the flicker of pain in her dark eyes, a familiar flicker he had seen in the eyes of his fellow soldiers who had lost too much in the war. He gently placed the wooden horse back in her hands, his touch as light as a whisper. Winona flinched. She was not used to such care from a white man. "I don't want anything from you," Carrick said, his voice soft but firm. "Just wanted to help." "That." Winona's eyes searched his, looking for any trace of ulterior motive. She had grown up with men who saw everything in terms of what they could take, but this man offered only kindness. It was a foreign concept to her, a different kind of weapon she didn't know how to handle. A moment later, an elderly Lakota man with a weathered face and a quiet dignity approached them. He spoke to Winona in his native tongue, his words sounding like rolling stones in a creek bed. Winona responded softly but with a clear, firm resolution. The elder's eyes fell upon Carrick, a searching, assessing gaze. Carrick simply nodded at the man, a gesture of respect from one stranger to another. Finally, Winona turned to him, her eyes still wary, but no longer filled with fear. Her composure broke completely. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You are very kind," she whispered, her voice breaking. I fear I may have made a terrible mistake. I have been accused of a terrible thing. Thank you, white man," she said, her accent thick but her words clear. Carrick felt his stomach tighten. He had heard tales of people running from trouble, but the pain in her eyes was too raw to be anything but true. He offered her a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "You don't have to say a thing," he said, his voice soft. "No matter what it is, girl, you'll find that out here. World is safe for you. I must go now." She gave a curt nod and followed the elder away, leaving Carrick standing alone on the platform. Carrick watched them go, her small, determined form walking away until she disappeared from view. His mind had completely forgotten about the supplies he had been waiting for. All he could think about was the girl, the trunk, and the tiny wooden horse that held a story. He had heard the stories, the lies, and the hateful rumors that painted all indigenous people with the same broad, savage brush. But Winona had shattered that simplistic caricature. He had seen her fragility, her pride, and her hidden grief. She was not a stereotype. She was a woman who had lost her brother, just as he had lost his father and his way of life. The brief encounter had planted a seed in Carrick's mind, a quiet curiosity that would not be easily dismissed. He didn't know it then, but the woman who had just walked out of his life was not a stranger passing through. She was a woman whose destiny was entwined with his own, and with the very land he called home. He would see her again, under circumstances that would test their courage and force them to choose between loyalty and love. This simple act of kindness on a dusty train platform was not a negotiation. It was the first chapter of a story neither of them could have ever imagined. The memory of the train station lingered, a faint but persistent scent of possibility on the wind. Carrick Montgomery found himself replaying the brief, tense encounter with Winona again and again, the image of her proud, hurt face and the chipped wooden horse, a brand seared onto his memory. He was a man of action, a builder of fences and a mender of what was broken, but this was a problem he couldn't solve with his hands. The mystery of her grief, the fierce dignity with which she carried it, stirred something he hadn't felt in years, a quiet curiosity that made him look at his own world with new eyes. He told himself to focus on the endless work of the ranch, but the image of her face would interrupt his thoughts as he mended a post or checked on the herd. 2 weeks later, the first true autumn storm rolled in, a brutal, unforgiving front that blotted out the sun and unleashed an icy barrage of hail. It wasn't a mere shower, it was a punishment, a lashing of cold and wind that turned the prairie into a battlefield. Carrick rushed to herd his cattle into the shelter of the barn, but he knew with the grim certainty of a man living at the mercy of the elements that some of his stock would be lost. The hail gave way to a relentless, bone-chilling rain that turned the dusty earth to clinging mud. He worked through the night, a silent, solitary figure, his only companions the lowing of the nervous cattle and the howl of the wind. The following morning, the world was a study in desolation. The sky was a bruised gray, and the land was a sodden, broken mess. Fallen trees littered the landscape, and the creeks had swollen into muddy torrents. Carrick mounted his horse, Buck, his every muscle aching. He picked his way carefully through the mire, his gaze searching for his lost calves. The bitter cold bit at his face, but he paid it no mind. A man's life out here was measured in his ability to endure. He found the first group of calves huddled against a broken fence, shivering and miserable. He was able to get them moving with a few prods from his boot, but as he continued his search, his heart sank. He found a young calf, no bigger than a large dog, lying motionless near a small, flooded creek. Its hide was soaked, and its body was rigid with cold. He dismounted quickly, kneeling in the muck. The calf was still alive, but barely. Its shallow breaths were punctuated by a wet, rattling cough. As he began to rub its hide, a voice cut through the damp silence, its words as clear as the creek water. "Calf yours?" Carrick looked up, and for a moment the world felt like it had tilted on its axis. Standing amidst the battered aspen saplings, a small, yet powerful figure, was Winona. She was wrapped in a worn wool blanket over a simple buckskin tunic, and in her hand she held a bundle of dried herbs. Her face was solemn, her eyes dark and serious. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. "What are you doing here?" Carrick asked, the surprise evident in his voice. He knew her people did not typically stray so close to the settlements. "This land is ours," Winona said, her voice not hostile but simply stating a fact. "I came to gather medicines. The storm has felled many trees, but it has also unearthed many things." She stopped, her gaze falling on the shivering calf. "This calf will not make it if you do not bring it inside immediately." "I know," Carrick replied, "but I cannot do it alone." Without another word, Winona knelt beside the calf. Her touch was gentle, deliberate. She placed a hand on its small, cold forehead. "Its hide is cold as ice," she murmured, then began to rub a clump of pungent, dried sage-like herb on its nose. The strong, earthy scent filled the air, and the calf let out a low groan, its breathing seeming to ease. "This herb helps it breathe," she explained, her eyes still on the calf, "but it needs warmth immediately." Carrick was astounded. He was a man of logic and practicality, a rancher who relied on the vet and the few medical books he owned. He had never seen a plant used in such a manner. He looked at Winona not as a Lakota girl, but as a person with a profound and intimate knowledge of this land, a knowledge that far surpassed his own. They worked together, their movements in a surprisingly seamless rhythm. Winona quickly fashioned a crude stretcher from fallen branches, lashing them together with a strong vine. Carrick used the ropes from his saddle to secure the calf to it. They hauled the heavy stretcher toward his homestead, a back-breaking task through the treacherous mud and storm debris. Along the way, Winona pointed out different plants, explaining their uses. She showed him which roots to pull for food, which leaves to boil for tea. She spoke of hidden springs and how the storms, though destructive, also carried new seeds to the soil, ensuring life continued. Carrick listened intently. She was not just teaching him about nature, she was teaching him a different way of living, a different way of seeing. When they reached his ranch, Winona looked around with a hint of curiosity. The sturdy log cabin, the corrals, the vast, empty prairie. The isolation of the place was clear, even in the daylight. Carrick invited her inside to warm up. She hesitated for a moment, but the cold and exhaustion were too great to refuse. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackled, a warm, welcoming sound. The air smelled of wood smoke and old leather. Winona's eyes drifted to the photographs on the mantelpiece, a kind-faced older woman and a young man in a Union uniform. "Your family?" Winona asked, her voice soft. "Yes," Carrick replied, his voice dropping slightly. "My mother and my younger brother. They're both gone. My mother passed 3 years ago, And my brother, he trailed off, his gaze fixed on the photo of the young man, his uniform too big for his slight frame. He died in the Civil War. I came out here to start over. It was too hard to stay where everything reminded me of them. Winona nodded slowly, a profound understanding in her eyes. Me too, she said. I came here because I could no longer be at the reservation. Too much grief, too many ghosts. She looked out the window, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Everything has changed. The river, the hills, even the wind does not feel the same. Carrick listened, his heart aching with an empathy that transcended language. He didn't know her specific pain, but he knew the empty feeling of loss. He realized that despite their different skin and different cultures, they were both survivors, carrying scars that could not be washed away. "The wooden horse," Carrick began, his voice barely a whisper. "Was it your brother's?" Winona nodded, her gaze fixed on the fire. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "It was a birthday gift from me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He dreamed of being a great warrior, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, just shook her head. Carrick understood. Some wounds are too deep to be put into words. He didn't ask her to. Instead, he reached out and handed her a warm cup of coffee he had just poured. "I'm sorry," Carrick said, his words genuine. "I'm sorry for what happened to your people." Winona shook her head. "It is not your fault," she said. "You did nothing wrong." "I know," Carrick replied. "But I know what that kind of sorrow feels like." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds being the crackling fire and the wind whistling around the chimney. In that moment, the prejudices of the town, the cruel words at the station, the vast cultural chasm that separated them, it all evaporated. They were just two people, two sets of scars, sitting in a home that had just begun to feel like a refuge. Carrick's earlier vision of her as a lost princess was replaced with a deeper truth. He saw a woman of immense courage and strength, her quiet dignity, a testament to her resilience. Winona, in turn, saw a man who was more than just a settler. She saw a man who carried his own wounds and who, for some reason, was willing to share his hearth with someone the world had taught him to fear. When Winona finally rose to leave, Carrick handed her a bundle of jerky and a small sack of flour. "Do not refuse," he said. "This is my thanks for your help." Winona looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. She took the bundle and gave a slight bow of her head, a gesture of respect that Carrick had seen from her people before. "My name is Carrick," he said. "Winona," she replied. After she had gone, he walked back to the barn to check on the calf. It was still weak, but a little warmer. He saw the world she had described, a world where every storm carried a new promise, where the earth held secrets that could heal and provide. It was a world he had only seen from the outside, a world he had no language for. He found himself looking at his own land differently now. The gnarled branches of a dead tree were no longer just a hazard. They were potential kindling. The stubborn rock outcroppings weren't simply obstacles. They were markers on a trail only a native could see. He had started a ranch, but he was just beginning to learn how to truly belong. And he had a feeling that Winona, with her quiet strength and her deep knowledge of this land, held the first lesson. Sand, a love born between two worlds. The brief, charged meeting by the creek had done more than erase barriers. It had built an invisible bridge between their two separate worlds. From that day on, Carrick found he couldn't return to his solitary life. Winona's image, her quiet strength and deep wisdom, had become a permanent part of his thoughts. He knew that to truly understand her, he had to cross the chasm that both of their communities had built. A week later, Carrick rode Buck out to find her. He didn't know exactly where she lived, but he followed the small game trail she had pointed out to him. He found her by the river, weaving a basket from willow branches. She looked up as he approached, her eyes showing no surprise. "I knew you would come," she said simply. Carrick dismounted, a strange sense of relief washing over him. He handed her a small bundle. "I wanted to repay you. The calf is strong and healthy, and I returned it to its mother." Winona opened the bundle. Inside were steel sewing needles and a spool of thread, small but invaluable to a Lakota woman living far from the reservation. "Thank you, Carrick," she whispered, and for the first time he saw her truly smile. It was a fleeting, soft thing, like a whisper of wind, but it lit up her entire face. "Do you know that every tool we use has a spirit? These needles will bring warmth to my people." Though, from then on, they met often, not to trade, but to learn. Carrick taught her how to ride, a skill she had never had the chance to learn. He was astounded to find she was a natural. When she sat astride Buck, she didn't just ride him, she became a part of him, as if she could feel the rhythm of his breath and the thoughts in his head. She glided across the golden prairie, her braided hair flying in the wind, and Carrick realized her beauty wasn't in her eyes or her smile, but in that wild, untamed freedom. In turn, Winona taught him how to live in harmony with the land. She showed him edible plants and the secret trails known only to those with the spirit of the earth in their blood. She told him stories of the old gods and her ancestors, and explained why a single fallen leaf was a symbol of life's enduring cycle. One afternoon, sitting together by the creek, Winona spoke of her younger brother. "His name was Seton," she said, her voice filled with a heartbreaking tenderness. "He was like a hawk, fierce and free. He always dreamed of having his own horse, and I carved that wooden one for him. But then the soldiers came." Her voice broke. "They took so many of our young men. I don't know if he is still alive, but every time I see that horse, I remember his dream." Carrick's hand tightened into a fist. He felt the weight of her grief. "After the war," he said, his own voice low, "people wanted me to be the man who left, but I couldn't be. I had seen things a person can't unsee. My fiancée broke our engagement. She said I had changed, and I knew she was right. I wasn't the man who went away." Winona gently touched his hand. "You did not change, Carrick," she said. "You grew, and you found yourself." Her words were not just comfort. They were a profound understanding. For the first time, Carrick felt truly seen. In her eyes, he wasn't a soldier with scars, but a man who had found his path. Their feelings for each other blossomed as naturally as the wild prairie flowers. There were no romantic words, only quiet acts of care. Carrick brought her supplies she needed, from flour to tobacco. Winona made him gifts with her hands, from a small deerskin pouch to a piece of carved bone jewelry. Once, when Carrick cut his hand on a fence, Winona used a poultice of herbs to heal it. The scent of the medicine and the gentleness of her hands lingered with him for days. But the world they lived in was no fairy tale. One day, as Carrick rode with Winona near town to pick up supplies, a man he recognized from the train station saw them. The man swaggered toward them, a sneer on his face. "Well, Carrick Montgomery, got a good horse, good cattle, and now a good little squaw to keep you company, eh? Moving up in the world." Winona's hand clenched on the reins, her eyes burning with a cold fury. Carrick dismounted and stood in front of her. "This is not your business, Jedediah," he said, his voice a low growl. "I reckon it is everyone's business," the man spat. "A white man cavortin' with an Indian. That's bad luck for all of us. Zay." The words felt like a knife in Carrick's gut, but a wave of pure, protective love washed over him. He knew their feelings would be met with hatred, with whispers and prejudice. But he would not back down. He took Winona's hand, and though it was cold, he held it tight. "Don't worry," he said to her, his eyes never leaving Jedediah's. "I won't let them hurt you." They returned to the ranch, a heavy silence hanging between them. Winona sat by the fire, her hands in her lap. "Perhaps you should let me go," she said, her voice small. "I only bring trouble." Carrick knelt before her, gently taking her hands in his. "Don't say that, Winona. You aren't trouble. You're the reason I finally found myself. You showed me that life isn't just about working, but about living and loving. You've given me a purpose, and I don't want to live without that purpose anymore." Tears welled in Winona's eyes. "But they will never accept us," she said. "Then we will build our own world," Carrick replied. "A world where we are judged not by our skin, but by our hearts. A world where we will be enough for each other." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love so profound it stole her breath. "I love you, Winona. I love you because you are you, strong and fierce and full of compassion. I don't love you for what you can do for me, but for what you have brought to my life." Winona's tears fell freely now, a mix of sorrow and immense relief. She wrapped her arms around him, and in his embrace she found peace. Carrick kissed her, not with a demanding passion, but with a gentle tenderness that spoke of understanding and acceptance. The kiss was a seal, a silent promise. "Hey, friend, go grab a full glass of water. People often forget to drink enough, and that's actually a pretty serious issue for you." The fire in the hearth crackled, its light dancing on the walls of the cabin. Carrick held her close, her head resting against his chest, her heart beating in rhythm with his. Outside, the world was full of prejudice and hatred, but inside these four walls, a new world was being built. A home forged not from wood and stone, but from shared pain, quiet understanding, and a profound love that had found a way to bridge two entirely different worlds. They had found each other on the harsh frontier, and in a place where they had both come to find solitude, they had found a place to truly belong. The days that followed were a gentle dream, a quiet pocket of peace carved out of the rugged frontier. Carrick and Winona's love had weathered the first storm of hatred, and their affection had become a sanctuary. They worked together on the ranch, rebuilding fences battered by the hail, tending to a small garden they had started near the creek. Carrick had never truly felt the ranch was a home until Winona was there. The way she looked at the hills, her voice weaving stories of the earth spirits, her laugh when he taught her how to tie a proper knot, it all made his life feel whole. His cabin, once a lonely fortress, now held the warmth of a shared existence. But the outside world would not let their dream endure. It came on a Saturday afternoon, as Carrick and Winona sat on the porch, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. A neighbor, his face pale with panic, galloped toward them on a foam-flecked horse. "Carrick," he yelled, his voice ragged with fear. "A band of hostiles just raided the Thompson place. They took all their horses and half their cattle. Thompson says 2 of them were from the reservation." Carrick shot to his feet, a cold dread running down his spine. He looked at Winona. Her face had gone utterly still, her eyes clouding over. She seemed to know what was coming before he did. He said 2 of them were wearing tribal clothes, and one of them had a big scar on his face. The name Jedediah flashed through Carrick's mind. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. "We're forming a posse," the neighbor said, his voice now filled with a desperate rage for retribution. "We're riding to the reservation first thing tomorrow. We're going to take back what's ours." Carrick felt as if 2 invisible hands were tearing him in half. On one side was the promise he had made to Winona, a promise to build a world of their own. On the other was his loyalty to his community, to the men he had lived alongside, the neighbors with whom he had shared his coffee and his bread. He had chosen to live with these people, and now they were calling on him. "I won't go," Carrick said. His voice was low, and though he tried to keep it steady, a tremor of defiance ran through it. "We can't just ride into the reservation. It could start a war." "No." The neighbor looked at him, his expression turning from fear to deep suspicion. "They already started a war, Carrick," he said, his voice accusing. "Can't you see what's happening? They attacked us." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Winona standing beside Carrick. "Maybe she told you what they were planning," he sneered. Carrick clenched his jaw. "Get out of here," he said. "I won't be a part of it." After the neighbor left, Carrick turned to Winona. She was still standing motionless on the porch. "You don't believe me?" she asked, her voice so small it was almost inaudible. "I don't doubt you," Carrick said, but he felt a cold sliver of doubt creep into his heart. He tried to fight it, but it was there, a snake in his chest. I can't understand why they would do this. They have a treaty." Winona turned away, looking out at the distant hills. "That treaty is just promises on paper," she said. "Do you see how they live? They are forced onto land that cannot feed them. They are starving. Do you see the anger in their eyes? They have lost everything, their freedom, their honor, and now their lives. They have nothing left to lose." A profound ache settled in Carrick's heart. He had tried to create a world where these things didn't exist, but Winona's pain was now his pain. He knew she was speaking the truth. He had seen the haunted, hungry faces on the reservation. He had seen the despair of a people being driven to extinction. That night, Carrick couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the stars glittering outside the window, each one a pinprick of frozen light. He thought about his neighbor's words. He was one of them. They had given him a chance to start over. They had trusted him. But his love for Winona had made him an outsider. He was a white man who loved a native woman. He was living in a world of his own, while the world he had left behind was burning. The next morning, when the sun rose, Carrick found Winona sitting by the creek. She was watching a flock of birds flying north. He sat down beside her, a small but significant distance between them. "I heard," Winona said. "Jedediah told the others that you refused to join. They will never trust you again." "I couldn't," Carrick said, his voice full of torment. "I couldn't do that to you, to them." "Well," Winona turned to him, her eyes filled with an infinite sadness. "Carrick," she said, "I am Lakota. Our love, it is beautiful, and it is everything, but I cannot forget that I am Lakota. I am part of them. I feel their pain. I know why they do the things they do." Carrick clenched his hands, his nails digging into his palms. "So what are you saying?" he asked, his voice thick with a terrible desperation. "Are you leaving? Are you going to leave me?" Winona closed her eyes. A single tear escaped and slid down her cheek. "I don't know, Carrick," she said. "I don't know. I cannot turn my back on them. I cannot watch them starve. But I cannot live without you either." She turned to face him, tears now falling freely. "I found myself with you. I found a home. But a Lakota cannot live without her tribe." Carrick pulled her into his arms, feeling as though he were holding a wisp of smoke, a soul that could drift away at any moment. For the first time, their love wasn't a source of strength, but a crushing burden. It had placed them in an impossible situation, where they were forced to choose between love and communal duty. Carrick felt like he had failed. He had promised Winona they would create their own world, but that world was collapsing before his eyes. He had tried to build a home, but a storm had come, a storm of hatred and sorrow, and the walls were crumbling. He loved Winona, but that love couldn't erase decades of suffering, broken promises, and the scars of history. They sat in silence. The sun rose higher, but offered no warmth. There were moments when Carrick looked at her and wondered if he truly understood her at all. Did he know what she had sacrificed to be with him? Did he know what she had given up for his love? And he felt a profound fear. Their love might have been selfish, a selfishness they would both have to pay for. Their life was not a love story. It was a war where they now stood on opposite sides of the battlefield. They were no longer two people who had found each other. They were two worlds, two peoples, two paths facing each other. And for the first time, they had no idea which way would lead them home. The sun rose on a world broken. The warmth of the fire that had kept them safe the night before was now just a pile of cold ash. Carrick and Winona sat at the kitchen table, their mugs of coffee untouched, the silence between them as vast and heavy as the open prairie outside. The impossible choice hung in the air, a sword poised over a love they had built so carefully, so desperately. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the resolute woman he had come to love, but a stranger, haunted and lost. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if she could already see the path she would have to take. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. "They'll ride in the morning," Carrick said, his voice a hoarse whisper. It was the first thing either of them had said since the sun had come up. "My neighbors. They'll ride with their rifles loaded." Winona finally turned to him. "And what will you do?" she asked. There was no accusation in her voice, only a profound, heartbreaking sadness. She knew the answer, and she knew what it would cost them both. Carrick's hands, usually so steady and capable, trembled as he gripped his mug. He had spent the entire night battling his conscience, his loyalty to his neighbors, and his love for Winona at war. He had found no truce, no middle ground. The simple, brutal logic of the frontier had offered him only one path. "I won't ride with them," he said, the words a silent promise to her, and a defiant act against his own people. I can't just do nothing. I'll ride to the reservation ahead of them. I'll tell your people what's coming. Maybe I can convince them to return the cattle, to prevent a fight." Winona's expression didn't change. She simply closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "You don't understand," she said, her voice filled with a terrible certainty. "They will not listen to you. You are a white man. You are part of the world that has taken everything from them. And my people, they are filled with too much anger, too much grief. They will see you as a threat." "I have to try," he insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. He felt like a boy trying to stop a tidal wave with his bare hands. But he had to try. He had to prove to her that their love was a force stronger than hatred. "I have to try for us." "There is no us in this," Winona said, her voice filled with a finality that made his heart clench. "There is only our two worlds. They have collided, Carrick, and now we must pick up the pieces." She stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and walked over to her trunk in the corner. She lifted the lid, and her eyes fell on the small wooden horse figurine he had first seen at the train station. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the tiny chipped edges. Carrick watched her, a suffocating fear rising in his throat. He felt the words forming on his lips, the frantic, panicked plea for her to stay, to fight for their love. But he knew, with a devastating clarity, that this was not a fight he could win. It was a choice she had to make, and he knew what her heart was telling her. Winona turned, the figurine clutched in her hand. "I must go back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I cannot stay here, safe in your home, while my people are starving. I am Lakota Carrick. That is who I am, and they are my family." He felt the walls of his world crumbling. He had built it so carefully, a life for them both, a refuge from the world's madness. But he had built it on land that was stolen, and his love, pure as it was, could not erase that fundamental truth. "I love you," he said, his voice raw with pain. "Stay with me. We'll figure it out. We'll build our world here." Winona shook her head, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking regret. "Our world was never here, my love," she said. "It was a beautiful, fleeting dream that we shared, a fragile moment of peace in a time of war. But the real world, the world of history and pain and blood, has found us. I must go to my people. I must try to be a bridge, to find a way for them to live. I have to try." She walked to the door and paused, her hand on the latch. He saw her shoulders straighten, her chin lift, as she prepared to step back into the world that had cast her out. She was no longer just his Winona. She was a woman of her people, ready to make a sacrifice he couldn't fathom. She was leaving him, not out of a lack of love, but out of a profound and unshakable sense of duty. "Take this," she said, pressing the wooden horse into his hand. Its smoothness, its simple beauty, felt like a promise and a memory all at once. "So you never forget the boy who dreamed of horses and the woman who loved him." Then she was gone. The door closed behind her with a soft click, a sound that resonated in the hollow space she left behind. Carrick stood there for what felt like an eternity, the wooden horse a weight in his hand, a tangible reminder of a love that had been and a future that would never be. He never joined the posse. He simply watched them ride out the next morning, a band of angry, fearful men, their rifles glinting in the pale morning light. He knew they would never trust him again. He was a man who had chosen a native woman over his own kind, and in the unforgiving world of the frontier, that was a sin for which there was no forgiveness. He remained on his ranch, a solitary figure once more. The days that followed were filled with a silence that was far more deafening than any storm. The home he had once thought was full of life now felt emptier than it had ever been. He would sit on the porch in the evenings, the wooden horse in his hand, and look out at the vast, golden prairie. The land, which had once felt full of promise, now seemed to stretch out into an endless loneliness. Their love had been real, a beacon of hope in a world filled with hatred. But it had come too soon, in a time when the world wasn't ready for it. It had been a tender sapling planted on a battlefield, and it had been crushed underfoot before it ever had a chance to grow. He had loved her fiercely, and she had loved him in return. But in the end, love had not been enough. Carrick never saw Winona again. Yet every night, beneath the endless canopy of stars stretching across the Wyoming sky, he would hold the small wooden horse in his hand and let his thoughts drift toward her. Was she safe in the arms of her people? Had she found a place to call home, a refuge in a world that had taken so much from her? He could not know. All he carried was the memory of her dark, unwavering eyes, her quiet strength, and the bittersweet ache of a love that could never fully belong. What they had shared was more than a fleeting romance. It was a Wild West love story, fragile yet fierce, carved into the very soil of the frontier. It was the kind of tale whispered in cowboy love stories, where duty and love collide under the wide prairie skies. And though she was gone, the memory lingered like an ember, a spark that lived on in the Wild West stories, yet to be told, a promise of a better world, a world he might never see, but one his heart would always believe in.